top 10 things that may surprise you about shared ownership. So, when we're talking about shared ownership, that is basically housing associations when they're selling you normally a flat and you will buy a percentage of it. So, shared ownership, you share some of it, the housing association shares some of it, and the amount that you don't share, you actually rent. Now, let's start at the very first one. Point number one, share ownership, you will always be a leaseholder. Now, what's the difference between a leaseholder and a freeholder? When you buy a house, you are a freeholder. You own the land that the building is on and you own the building. You don't have service charge, you don't have ground rent. That is the rules. When you are a shareholder, when you've got shared ownership, you are a leaseholder. As a leaseholder, you will own whatever part that you've purchased of the property. So it could be, 50, 60%, whatever it is, and the rest that you rent. But the ground that it is on, which is basically the difference between freeholder and leaseholder, will always be the housing associations, which means you will always have to pay service charge and ground rent. Not all properties are allowed to have full ownership. Now, what I mean by this is when someone comes to me personally and says they want to get a shared ownership, I always come up with a 5-year strategy of where they can staircase. Now, they can do two things. They can either go, for example, on a 2-year fixed, then remortgage the whole lot, borrow more, and buy more, a higher percentage. This is called staircasing. So they could start at 60%, and then after 2 years they could remortgage and get additional borrowing and get 70%, for example, so buy an extra 10%. Or they could go with something like a 5-year fixed, and then after a year, 2 years, even 6 months, actually, you can do additional borrowing. So you've got your main mortgage, which has, say, the 60%, and then you've got additional borrowing where you've bought an extra 10%. And then after a year, you could, after the 2 years, you could remortgage again, get another 10%, remortgage again, get another 10%. And in the end, when you get up to either 90 or 95%, you can remortgage off completely a shared ownership mortgage and get a normal mortgage because you're buying them out. Now, what not everybody realizes is, and you need to read the fine print or get your solicitor to read the fine print and explain it to you, they don't always give you the opportunity to own 100%. Sometimes you can only staircase, as in buy parts of it, up until 95%. So that's something to be aware of. Then be aware of the valuation fee. Every single time you do this staircasing, buy an extra percentage. So when they first calculate how much you can buy from the off, there's a valuation charge. Every single time you buy more, there is valuation charges, because at the end of the day, they need to calculate how much the property is. I was speaking to someone today, actually, and they were talking about how they've actually done some work on their property while they're in the shared ownership, and I had to be honest, that's really not a good idea, because at the end of the day, when you go to buy more of the property, because you've actually done it up, you've improved on it, so you've actually increased the value. If you don't own it 100%, you don't benefit from 100% of that value. In fact, it goes against you, because when they value it for you to buy an extra 10 or 20%, it's included. So you've actually done it up and you've done them a favour. And the majority of the time, I've never heard of someone doing up their shared ownership and then the housing association reimbursing some of their fees. So not only are they going to charge you more for the additional bit you want to buy because your property is now in a better condition, but they're not going to reimburse you for the money you've spent on the property. So, I mean, as a normal homeowner, if you spend a lot of money on your property, like for instance, at this place, I've gone up into the loft and up on as an extension as well, and the property has increased in value. I mean, my flats that I rent have also increased in value because I've done work on them, but I own them. So I benefit from the appreciation of the asset as opposed to somebody else. The next thing is stamp duty. Now, stamp duty at the moment, the exemption for first time buyers is 425,000. If it's over that and you buy a percentage of that, then at the end of the day, you have to pay stamp duty. Now, what some people do, and I know what one of my clients did, is she paid stamp duty on the whole 100% of the property, even though she'd only bought 60%, because her logic, which makes sense, is 60% of the property, yes, was below, but then once you've past that stamp duty exemption, you do not get it again. So when you go to do another 10%, they're going to charge you stamp duty, and another 20%, they're going to charge you stamp duty, because you're no longer a first time buyer, because you've already bought it the first time when you bought the 60% or whatever. Now, I hope you're enjoying this video and it is making sense. I am doing a workshop to explain this with actual figures in more details. So by all means, DM me if it's something that's of interest to you. Please share this video with people that are thinking of shared ownership or already in a shared ownership, because I think this will really help. The next thing to look at is rent. Now, when you have a shared ownership, and the example I've been using is when you own 60%, that means you're renting 40%. Now, on the day that you complete your 60% and they tell you what the rent is for the 40%, that rent can go up within 6 months, a year, whenever they decide to do a rent review, and obviously it will be in your literature when it will be, they can increase the rent. So based on that, you may think in a couple of years time you'll buy an extra 10%, but if they increase the rent and you can't afford to, then you may be stuck owning 60% for a long time. So that's why I come up with a 5-year strategy to try and get you owning 100% as soon as you can, because even though you will always pay service charge and ground rent because of the leasehold, you don't always have to pay rent. Once you own 100%, no more rent. The next thing is selling can be quite complicated. Now, what I mean by that is when you're selling your property, if you decide to sell it later on down the line, most people, once they own it 100%, can rent it out. That is one of again, checking the details, but that's normally something that I would encourage if it's allowed. But if you decide to sell it and move on somewhere else, one, if you don't own 100% of it, is really difficult to sell. But two, if you do buy the whole thing out and then you go to sell it, you can't always sell privately. At the end of the day, there may be a clause that after a certain amount of years that the housing association gets first refusal, and they can have an influence over how much you can sell it for. So that obviously is a concern. The next thing is maintenance costs. You will have to pay maintenance costs. They're still your responsibility, even if you own 40%, 60%, whatever the percentage is, they are your responsibility. Mortgages. So as a mortgage advisor, obviously I'm well aware of the different types of mortgages, but shared ownership mortgage is a specialist mortgage, so that's something you need to take into consideration. Shared ownership is its own scheme, so you can't overlap different schemes with the shared ownership scheme because it is its own scheme. So that's something to be aware of. So sometimes it's great to get on the property ladder with a shared ownership, but you don't always save in the long run. Once you look at how long you have to rent it for, how much it costs for staircasing, the additional stamp duty, the restrictions if you want to sell on, I could go on and on. It really, you really need to have the best strategy and understand, which is why with my clients, I do go through all of that with them when they decide they want to do shared ownership, because I've talked a lot about the cons, but there are pros. You can get on the ladder maybe sooner than you would if you'd waited to buy 100% of a property, for example. So I hope this video has been helpful. By all means, as I said, share it, subscribe to my channel, please, if you want to get more first time buyer, first time landlord information. And thank you for your time.